Hello and welcome to my debate with Epicurus A. Greek. I'd like to thank my opponent for putting his time and energy to produce his side of this debate and agreeing to debate with me. I look forward to his rebuttals. Let's all remember to attack his argument, not the person. Now, a small explanation of this debate I think is in order. The topic at hand is Avicenna's argument from contingency logically valid? My answer is no. However, my opponent and I didn't want to simply have an asymmetrical dialogue where I would be merely analyzing his argument and asking tough questions. Rather, I will be also offering a persuasionary dialogue that he has to rebuttal. The format we're using is the standard debate form. Each of us gets an opening, and then each gets to rebuttal that opening, and then rebuttal the rebuttals, and so on until we've felt like there's been enough exchanges. We have not set any time constraints or how many video constraints or anything like that, although if that becomes necessary, we'll set that up in private and announce it in public. So, with that explanation aside, on to my opening remarks. We humans define words, and we must do this in order to make sure that the word we are using is something that the other understands and agrees on. So if I say share and the other person has no idea what that is, we can point to a share, we can discuss the component pieces of the share, and we can come to a clear understanding of what it is that we're talking about. There are cases where a single name refers to multiple ideas. For example, I could name a cat dog. So when I said dog, I'm actually calling my cat. So there's that natural language problem that can come up. And there are words that have different meanings across different languages, and of course words in English that have multiple meanings. So we need to stick to one definition of a word in order to make sure that both parties are on the same page. When we consider the word God, this sort of definition becomes problematic. Every culture and every individual has a different view of what or whom God is or is not. When we try to approach God from one particular view, say Christianity, we neglect humans that do not share that view of God. Their version of God is not the same. Unlike the share, the word God is not something that we can just point to and explain by writing down what it is or drawing a picture of it. The word God is a universal and is also a particular. Where does the idea of God come from? Some say divine revelation, and others say humans made it up. And if we did, we also seem to have created some arguments for the ideas of God. If it is divine revelation, we can't know that that's the case because there's no way to test if it's divine revelation. At least none that I'm aware of. So, is the only choice then to assume that the idea of God comes from the human brain? I think that that is the only rational choice to go to. What about the argument for God? If we had one that was logically coherent, we could still think that humans had made up that idea of God and just happened to create an argument for that particular God. We could still be skeptical about it. And the reason is because logic has a limitation. It cannot tell us what is real, only what is logically valid. Even when somebody has a logical argument, it does not make and cannot make a conclusion real. If my opponent is aware of the limits of logic, his opening argument should reflect the change from the deductive argument that the argument is currently in to a probabilistic argument, as well as some modifications to change the words to indicate that it's not meant to be seen as a thing in reality, but only a logically valid conclusion. I could only speculate to what it would mean if my opponent's argument doesn't reflect these changes that I expect. Plenty of apologists and theists seem to stick to the older arguments as if they prove their case, as if a logical argument is able to do more than what it can do. I can't say why theists or apologists would do this, only that they are trying to do something with the conclusions that would reach beyond what logic is able to do. Perhaps such a theist or an apologist could one day offer an argument to explain how logic is able to prove something is real. Perhaps my opponent will explain this in his rebuttal. But he need not, for none of my opening remarks are my argument itself, and could be ignored or discarded if my opponent sees fit. What my opponent does need to rebuttal is my argumentations. When I will be using these arguments, I will be substituting the letter G for the word God, and I'm going to be doing that to try to distance myself from that word and the various connotations of what it can mean thereof. So then, let me proceed to my argumentations. I have 3 of them. My opponent should rebuttal all 3 of them. If he does not, he risks having some problems later with leaving them open. Argument 1. Premise 1. G cannot be shown to exist outside of the human brain by empirical methodology. There is no test that one could do to show G, and there is simply no scientific evidence for anything like G. Premise 2. G can only be argued for by logic. Premise 3. There's probably no logical argument for G that shows it exists outside of the brain. Conclusion. We must be skeptical that G is a thing that exists outside of our brain. Argument 2. Premise 1. Humans have explained a great deal of phenomenon by natural forces. Premise 2. Phenomenons humans once explained by invoking G are now understood to be natural. Premise 3. We currently have some phenomenon that are unexplained. Premise 4. We might someday explain said unexplained phenomenon by natural forces. Premise 5. If G is not a natural force, then G will never be an explanation for anything. Conclusion. We do not require G as an explanation. Argument 3. Premise 1. Objects in space-time can be investigated. Premise 2. The supernatural is said to be outside of space-time and cannot be investigated. Premise 3. There is no justification, evidence, etc. of anything outside or beyond space or time. Premise 4. G is said to be supernatural. Conclusion. There is no justification of G. Now I want to have some summary of these argumentations. Argument 1 considers if we should be skeptical of G. If G exists, we must remain skeptical about it unless this argument fails. If argument 1 stands, then we should be skeptical about G existing anywhere except inside the brain. Argument 2 is if G is an explanation at all. If this argument stands, G might exist, but it would not be a necessary thing. It would ruin plenty of ideas about G, theologically speaking, but still, this argument doesn't get rid of all the potential G's out there, and it's not intended to do so. Argument 3 considers the lack of justification of any G. If G is supernatural, and some theists approach G to be natural, then if G would be natural, we have a natural explanation for it. If my opponent wants to invoke that sort of G, then this argumentation would be rendered moot. If my opponent does not, then they must produce a justification for the supernatural and G in their rebuttal. If argument 3 stands, G lacks justification for it, and we could be skeptical of it. The question of is Anselm's model argument logically valid is answered by me with the word no. My 3 arguments indicate why I say no, but do not go into detail with my objections to Anselm's argumentation. That will have to wait for my rebuttal, which will be my next video. I will, in that rebuttal, deconstruct the argument and show its errors in logic. This concludes my opening argumentation.